of his larger-than-life ideas, forms, and styles. A little bit about the history of the sonnet. Although Shakespeare is the most popular writer of sonnets, he's not the inventor of the sonnet. The sonnet was invented by the Italian poet Giacomo dei Latini in the 13th century, and then popularized by Francesco Petrarca in the 14th century. Sonnets weren't super popular in England until they were translated by Thomas Wyatt in the early 16th century, but by Shakespeare's time, they were definitely incredibly popular. In fact, yeah, this is kind of sticky, so you guys will have to bear with me. In fact, in Elizabethan court and other well-read circles, sonnets were passed around from person to person, addressed to lovers, friends, about things ranging from sex, death, life, love, all that kind of stuff. So Shakespeare, supposedly, most of his sonnets are actually addressed to at least several individuals, but regardless of what his audience was intended, he has captivated audiences throughout all of history. Let's see, so the Shakespearean sonnet, it's an artistic package that is both figuratively and literally bursting at the seam. By combining inventive language with extensive wordplay, Shakespeare created countless subtexts and hidden meanings in his works. Not only did Shakespeare reinvent the sonnet by pushing the boundaries of his own convention, he created an art form that seems to be somehow larger than life. So let's talk a little bit about this inventive language. Why would a poet choose to invent words? Now that kind of depends. Maybe it's going to sound nicer, maybe it's going to fit into a certain spot, but Shakespeare definitely was worried most about getting the most meaning in every line possible. And we're going to take a look at a couple examples of how he really does that. So this is from Sonnet 112, line 11. To critic and to flatterer. Now, flatterer was a popular word already, but critic hadn't been used until Shakespeare used it in Love's Labour's Lost. And it works really well in this because it's a two-syllable word that kind of counters flatterer. And so in order to create the most concise message in this small sonnet form, finding these small, maybe two or one-syllable words would have been very important. Unbless some mother in Sonnet 3, line 4. This kind of un-prefix, bless was obviously a popular word already. A lot of Shakespeare's inventive language was literally just putting the UN prefix or RE prefix or IN. So although it's not an entirely new word, it is an entirely different meaning. At the end of the day, Shakespeare, again, is trying to put as much meaning into every line as possible. By freeing up extra syllables, that means more room for more figurative language. Specifically, wordplay, and even more specifically, we're going to talk about puns and metaphors. So puns create double meanings. Excuse me. As in gentle. Gentle can be nobility, upper class, but it also can mean kind in nature. And lock is another great one. In Sonnet 138, there's actually quite a few different puns and double meanings, but he uses lie several times, as in lie, to sleep with, have sex with, but also to lie, to be false to. And the other thing that he uses a lot of is metaphors, which he allows him to link different meanings and messages together. You have one of the most famous opening lines, Sonnet 18, shall I compare thee to a summer's day. Now, in this sonnet, he's not directly comparing a woman to a summer's day, more supposing it, but the point remains, as he's able to create this link between things that are unlike, he's able to kind of bulk up the content in his poem without using any more lines. Now, some of these, also another great example, Sonnet 116, line 6, that looks on tempests and is never shaken. He's referring to love here, and he actually uses it a couple different ways. One, as a star in the sky that might guide a sailor, or in this case, actually a sailor who is never shaken in a storm. But these small contributions sometimes did stand alone, but most of the time they're part of building a larger subtext, which is what we're going to talk about next. Subtext. For Shakespeare, that means converting explicit lines into implicit lines or subtext. And you can see that in Sonnet 130, My Mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. This is a great sonnet because it kind of turns your typical idealization of women or lovers on its head. He uses incredibly literal language in this poem. But somehow, after using it so many times, it creates this very figurative meaning. By literally describing how this woman is, he's telling the audience how real she is. So this very literal translation has, this very literal passage has a figurative connotation. Again, from Sonnet 116, it is an ever-fixed mark. That's comparing love to the star in the sky. And one of my personal favorites, the opening line from Sonnet 23, as an unperfect actor on the stage. In this sonnet, he's using different wordplay and metaphors in order to create a bigger picture as an amateur actor trying to desperately fumble through his profession of love while on stage. It's important to realize, again, the deeper the subtext, the greater the figurative word count. In a sonnet, you only have 14 lines and 10 syllables on each line. That's 140 syllables in total. In order to get as much information into these as possible, he really does rely on information that is not physically textual. So what do you do when you can no longer fit any more figurative meaning into your words? Well, if you're Shakespeare, that means you pretty much just break whatever rules you want. When there's no more room for subtext, just add extra syllables. Who cares if you're over the syllable count? I mean, you're Shakespeare. You know what you're doing, which means you know when the rules can be broken. One of my, again, personal favorites, Sonnet 119, actually both of these are from 119. Went too far. They both have an extra syllable, and in this sonnet it's written seemingly very frantically. It's obvious that Shakespeare did not care that he was breaking the rules because the message he wanted to portray was that much more important. Again, another way he breaks the rules is overly slanted rhymes, come and doom, temperate and short of date. When you're trying to draw comparisons, you can't always afford to follow the rules. And for Shakespeare, when you're making that many comparisons, you really just don't care about the rules. So if Shakespeare's endgame is to put as much information into a poem as possible, then it kind of begs the question, why even choose the sonnet? It's very small, very structured, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room, and if you're going to break the rules, why even pay attention or follow them in the first place? One of the bigger reasons is that the sonnet was very popular, which means it was easily recognized. And then, because of that, it was even easier to draw attention to the changes in style and convention. If everyone knows what it's supposed to look like, then almost at first glance you can see that it's not quite how it's supposed to look. The other reason is that the simple and rigid structure means that, yeah, the rules are easy to follow, but even more importantly, that means the rules are even easier to intentionally break. Breaking the rules means you understand them. And that is very important for what we're going to talk about next. So, to recap a little bit, we know that creating a rich subtext by using inventive language and extensive wordplay is one of Shakespeare's biggest MOs. But even more than that, there's this idea of pushing the boundaries of convention. When you know the rules so well, not only can you afford to push them a little bit, but you can almost reimagine them. There's an ability to further deepen the subtext by doing this, and by supersaturating the poem with meaning, again, you are being able to put as much of your own intention into the poem as possible. So, a few parting words. Now, what does this all mean? yeah, we understand what Shakespeare is doing, but, you know, the guy's long dead, he's not writing anymore, everyone's read all of this stuff, where do we kind of fall into this? So, one of the things that's worth thinking about is, what exactly is the Shakespearean style? So, we've learned that knowledge and flexibility are a big part of this. Because Shakespeare is very knowledgeable about sonnet structure, he's able to be very flexible. And by approaching convention without actually conforming, he's able to create a kind of package that seems to burst at the seam. There's literally oftentimes more syllables in his sonnets than are even supposed to be there. One of the other fascinating things is the Shakespearean style in relation to modern art. Shakespearean style is very similar to the jazz and blues musicians of the 19th and 20th centuries. Jazz and blues utilize things called accidental notes or blue notes. Now these notes, compared to traditional scales, they sound wrong, is usually a way to describe them. But because these musicians have such a strong understanding of the convention, they're able to use these wrong notes in a way that actually sounds very appealing. Very similarly to what Shakespeare does with his slant rhymes, extra syllables, and other sorts of comparisons like that. Now, this is something that I would really like to impart with you guys before I finish up. Even you can be Shakespearean. Anyone can be Shakespearean. Shakespeare, the Shakespearean style is not just for Shakespeare nerds or for history nerds. Shakespearean style really means that flexibility in knowledge. If you know something well, you can do it with such a audacity that you transcend whatever rules most people can't even see past. So in that sense, I would like to leave you guys with a sonnet that I have written from me to you. This is my sonnet 17. Besieged we are by life to hold things dear, but how we hold that flame is much our own. So many squandered hearts are held to fear, while passion's skills grow slightened and unhoned. Betwixt these lines of life our edges fade. If some is not enough, enough's to blame. Our souls are sold for less than what is paid. These labors over time become our names. If love is in your heart, then set love free. For only if it's freed can it return. The world was made for you to be, so be. Only then shall love of life be learned. Well ventured time turned love to passioned art. So too shall love return to spoken heart. Thank you.
So we do have time now for around 7 minutes of questions before the next presenter, so feel free to raise your hand to ask anybody.
Oh, please.
Okay. Have you seen some kind of comparison for, like, did Shakespeare invent more words for the sonnets than for plays because of the syllable restriction?
He just because the plays are so much more, massive in word count, he definitely used his inventive language more for the plays. But oftentimes he would use words, like we saw one of the examples earlier, use words that he invented in the plays in his sonnets. So they definitely, I imagine, as he invented some of these words, they became, tools that he would frequently use whenever he found necessary. And I hope that answers your question a little bit. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Oh, yes. Are there sonnet police that that good try but not really a sonnet? I'm curious.
Yeah, I feel like maybe in modern settings you would find that even more. I think there is, because people have access to information so much more, you could kind of get some of those sonnet Nazis out there. And I think maybe before Shakespeare's time that could have been something. If you showed a sonnet to someone that was a little too out of the lines, they might roll their eyes and be like, "What? You're not even trying." Shakespeare definitely broke. If that was happening, I think Shakespeare definitely kind of put an end to that. sonnets are definitely looser because of him. Anything else? Yeah.
I was you were showing some lines from sonnets, and
Yeah.
I was struck by unperfect and unblessed and kind of
Mhm.
making those new words.
Oh yeah.
And I guess my question is, because I feel like nowadays you see this a lot, especially in like rap, for instance, where they come up with different words and different
Oh, yeah.
spellings. And I was just curious if you think that, because I always have wondered about it, and I wonder if that sort of misspelling and coming up with new words, do you think that's going to help drive, poetry and art forward? Do you think that's an important tool? Or
Absolutely. Absolutely. If there's anything we can learn from Shakespeare and people that embody the Shakespearean style, consciously or unconsciously, is that these rules are not defined. And they're defined specifically by society. So if what you're doing is received well, then it's fair game.
Right.
And yeah, so I think you do find people that don't like it. They like things to be the way they've learned them to be.
Right.
But that just does not go side by side with art, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, but for
Yeah.
that.
Sure.
Anyone else? Please.
How did he make sure that people understand the new words, or did it matter to him?
So yeah, that is definitely tricky. It's harder for us in a modern context to be certain because integrated into modern language. So there's tons of times when I'll find, especially doing this project, finding words that I wouldn't have ever imagined he invented. It sounds like something that's been around for a long time. But back then, you would have wanted to be careful. You needed to make sure they understood what you were saying, or else then it loses. Because again, his whole point is to pack as much intention into it as possible, and the intention doesn't really work if the reader doesn't receive it. So Shakespeare did a pretty good job, I think. I don't think his stuff's harder to understand because of how he writes it, not because of what the meanings of some of those inventive words, I don't think.
So you think he mostly uses context to make sure that words make sense
Absolutely.
even if they don't understand?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so with that.
Oh,
The one in particular, critic.
yeah.
Yeah.
Critic.
That one was interesting to me because it didn't have a root word, at least that I'm familiar with. I mean, like unblessed.
So
I could see someone understanding the meaning, but to come up with that, I don't know if at that time if there was a word that was kind of similar, so people.
So I don't have the notes right in front of me, but that is one of the words that I researched extensively. Yeah. I believe critical was definitely a word already,
Okay.
and so that could have been a pretty close. And I don't know, criticism maybe. One of the big things that Shakespeare did with his words is he would take nouns and make them into verbs, take verbs, make them into adjectives. So all you needed was just something to say, this is what a critic does. So basically he would have said criticism or critical. What is a person who's critical? And he would have thought they'd be a critic. So that's how he comes up with it. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you again, everyone.